if we would keep faith with those who had faith in us, if we would make democracy succeed, I say we must act now.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, it seemed, was always demanding action. Action to get us through the Great Depression. Action to get us into and then through World War II. He usually got it one way or another, by charm and politics, by guile and deception. But usually, in 4 terms, in dangerous times, he got what he wanted because he went after it with extraordinary leadership and with unrelenting hope.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
It wasn't true, of course. In 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt spoke those first words as president, there was a great deal more to fear than fear itself. And in the Great Depression, there were many terrors that were justified. What was true was Roosevelt's instinct. As he sat here in the family mansion at Hyde Park, New York, writing his first inaugural address, his instinct was that what the country wanted, had to have, was a president without fear.
NBC News presents Nothing to Fear, the legacy of FDR. Reported by John Hart.
All that is in me, said Franklin Roosevelt the man, cries out to go back to my home on the Hudson River. To the boy, home was a 1,000-acre estate, where as the only child of a country gentleman, he was raised to be exactly like his father. Never, oh never, said the mother, who kept young Franklin in dresses until the age of 5, did she aspire for him to become president. Still, it was hardly the mama's boy who took up riding the estate and hunting birds with his dog named Marksman. A solitary child schooled at home by tutors until he was 14. Once at prep school, he quickly became one of the boys on the scrub football team. The man who would spend his later years anchored to a wheelchair by polio was then the picture of virility, who, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I, went off to Europe to see some of the war for himself. The strong-willed mother remained an eminence in his life, but the strong-willed son went ahead and married his 5th cousin, Eleanor, defying his mother's maneuvers to delay the marriage, which very soon became a family of 4 boys and a girl. This busy and important young man was an attraction to women. It was long after his death that his affair with Lucy Mercer, Eleanor's secretary, became known publicly. Eleanor knew and offered divorce, but with his mother's insistence he refused, preserving what became a far less intimate marriage, and preserving a political future as well. A secret known only to her friends was that Eleanor didn't want to be First Lady. But when she did, she became a vital part of the New Deal. She became the president's legs, his eyes and ears, traveling easily where her crippled and occupied husband could not, taking up the causes of the downtrodden, and doing it so much and so far and wide, she became, as one historian said, the conscience of the administration.
One of my favorite cartoons is about my mother, is symbolized in the cartoon where she's coming out of a coal mine. And one of the coal miners at the top turns around and sees her and says, "My God, it's Mrs. Roosevelt." She went many, many places in the Appalachians and through these areas where there were many deprived people, largely in order to be able to give Father a first-hand report of the actual conditions.
The crippling of Franklin Roosevelt came at the height of his manhood. He was 39. He'd already been a state senator, the vice presidential candidate in 1920. and the active young gadabout whose easy airs earned him the name Feather Duster from young women. There's a good deal of speculation, but no agreement that polio matured and deepened him.
I think the effect of polio was not to necessarily make him a braver man or a more decisive person. I think it was more in line with perhaps forcing him to exercise patience. So on election night, as I was leaving his room, after he knew he'd been elected, I remember him saying to me, "Jimmy, I wish you'd do something for me." And I said, "What's that, old man?" And he said, "When you get upstairs, say a little prayer that I'll have strength enough to do this job." And I knew then that he was praying that he not only would have mental courage, but that he would have physical courage also.
Grandpa, will you teach me how to swim?
Sure will. All right.
He fought the polio much of his life, swimming vigorously at warm springs, adding strength where his body could develop it, resisting attention to his useless legs.
Water wings.
Oh, where above his water wings?
Somebody's swinging.
The presidential press cooperated, rarely mentioning his infirmity and almost never photographing him below the waist. Photographers who tried had their film taken away by the Secret Service. With reporters, there was a gentleman's agreement.
All of us who photographed Roosevelt had an understanding. We all agreed, and it was an unwritten law, that we would never photograph him walking.
The newspaper men in the press conferences, I suppose I went to practically every press conference he had, they were for him. They liked him. They were trying to use him, but at the same time they liked him, and it was a sparring match.
The regular news conference was a Roosevelt invention, making him the most accessible president so far. Informal, once or twice a week, and on his terms. They were not to quote him by name without special permission. To be sure he wasn't misquoted in the 1940 campaign, he bugged the news conferences for 11 weeks with a microphone hidden under his desk lamp. The device, a gift from David Sarnoff, head of RCA, also recorded office conversations, much of them Roosevelt talking foreign policy and spreading gossip about his opponent.
I give solemn warning to those people who think that Hitler has been blocked and halted.
Roosevelt's political personality and a new device, the radio, came of age at the same time. He was the first of the media presidents, and all the presidents since him have tried what he first succeeded at, going over the heads of his critics and the Congress to pull the people to him personally.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes, and I know that when you understand what we in Washington have been about... I want to talk with you very simply. I want to talk with you about a number of subjects, my friends, directly at this moment of sadness throughout most of the world. I want to tell you what has been done in the last...
Roosevelt had a tremendous spirit, a sense of fun. We tend to think of depression and war in such solemn ways, but during all this time, he liked to play jokes, he told jokes.
You undergraduates, and possibly some of you graduates who see me for the first time, have read in your newspapers and heard on the air that I was, at the very least, an ogre. A consorter with communists, a destroyer of the rich, a breaker of our ancient traditions, that I was driving the nation into bankruptcy, and that I breakfasted every morning on a dish of grilled millionaire. Actually, I am an exceedingly mild-mannered person, a believer in the capitalistic system, and for my breakfast, a devotee of scrambled eggs.
I did have a wonderful holiday. I've come back with all sorts of new lessons, which I learned from barracuda and sharks. I'm a tough guy.
Which camera do you want me to break?
simply by entering a room, he could exhaust all the oxygen in it. There wasn't any oxygen anymore. People sort of gasped a little. He was marvelous. Now you see it, now you don't. The cause was hopeless, and suddenly it was all achieved. His power of persuasion, sometimes I thought it was more than persuasion. It was almost as though he were able to bring them into his mind and show them the scene that he had to live with.
There is a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. The withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side. Farmers find no markets for their produce, and the savings of many years in thousands of families are gone. More important, a host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return.
American farmers had lost 2/3 of their income in the Great Depression. Now they were losing their farms in mass foreclosures. On one day in April 1932, 1/4 of the state of Mississippi was up for auction.
At the low point, corn went down to 2 cents a bushel. And that had to be number 2 yellow corn shelled. Livestock about 2.5 cents a pound. Well, this was terrible.
Emil Lorix witnessed a national farmers' rebellion. In fact, in South Dakota, he helped to lead it.
I saw foreclosures where they sold farmers out. For most farmers, it was a question of paying taxes and paying their bills, and I couldn't do it. By 32, there had been 34,419 farm foreclosures in South Dakota. Just think, that's almost half of the farm population. When half of the farmers in the state lose their homes and are evicted and foreclosed and dispossessed, it seems pretty hopeless, and no sympathy from government.
In the towns and cities, 1/3 of the wage earners of the country were unemployed. There wasn't any unemployment insurance. National income was cut by half.
They were selling apples on the street, these poor unfortunates, and we all remember that. And what degradation it was. And for 5 cents an apple, and they plead with you to buy an apple.
In a Washington hotel, a reunion of surviving New Dealers who went to Washington with Roosevelt gathered to remember his 100th birthday and the times he came to preside over.
I want to start out with a song about the Depression. All nature is sick, from her heels to her head, when a fellow is out of a job. She's all out of kilter, beyond all repair, when a fellow is out of a job. Every man that's a man wants to help move the world, but he can't when he's out of a job. He's left out behind, on the shelf he is curled, when a fellow is out of a job.
In 1931-2-3, in the real Depression, there was no such thing as unemployment compensation on a national scale. If you're out of work, you're out of work. It was an awful lot different picture than anybody can conceive of today, and it really was. The unemployed were in dire, dire straits.
For hundreds of thousands, losing a job meant losing their homes in foreclosure and eviction. In the first half of 1933, more than 1,000 homes were being foreclosed every day. Many of the homeless and jobless put up shanty towns and called them Hoovervilles for Herbert Hoover, the Depression president. There were no federal loans for housing. By 1933, panic had ruptured the banking system. 5,000 banks were broke. 9 million people lost their savings. There was no Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation.
The banks were closed. I couldn't buy myself a dinner. And I thought this was the end of the world.
Every bank in the country was closed. You came home and you said, I couldn't cash this check. We went down to the bank is closed. And no one knew what was going to happen. And there were demagogues in the land who knew they had ideas of what to do. And if they had gone into effect, we would have had a species of revolution.
Communists, thinking the country was ripe for revolution, led a riot in New York City. Some capitalists were afraid the system was too weak. A North Carolina congressman proposed dictatorship. The noted journalist Henry Hazlitt suggested in Scribner's magazine that Congress be replaced by a directorate of 12 men.
This was just crazy.
You
we had the factories, we had the people to work, we had the food, but we couldn't sell. There was something wrong. Something had to be done.
The people were desperate.
This nation is asking for action, and action now.
If you remember, the banks were about ready to fail, and therefore they were all closed. There was a financial panic that pretty much gripped the country, and therefore the very first night that we went to work on the financial situation, the cabinet sat in the White House practically the whole night long, and I was there as a sort of unofficial aide to my father. I remember it very clearly, the tenseness of the situation and the feeling that we must find the answers to what had to be done to save the situation. Because part of the problem, if not the largest part of the problem, was restoring faith and hope and dignity to individual Americans who were pretty near the panic button at that time.
The presidential honeymoon was carved into American tradition during Roosevelt's first 100 days in office. Congress gave him everything he asked, billions of dollars of relief and reform legislation, 15 major acts. They were the beginnings of the New Deal, which went on to outlaw manipulation of the stock market and financial speculation by bankers with depositors' money. Today, nearly all deposits are insured up to $100,000 by a New Deal agency, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The New Deal made the federal government the subsidizer of American agriculture, refinanced 1/5 of the mortgages on American homes and farms, put 4.5 million people to work on public works in the first winter of his administration, built what is still the biggest electric utility in the country, gave 2 million part-time jobs to students, and taught 1.5 million adults how to read. A presidency of action now that changed the role of government and changed the expectations of Americans.
He would create the agency, and they'd give it a name, and then the name would have some kind of initials. It's as simple as that.
There was no comprehensive, well-organized, well-fitted together kind of set of programs.
The point was that he took that one revolutionary idea that the government is responsible. That's right. For the economy and for the poor.
Hey, when you're working for the NRA, you get shorter hours, you get more pay. Sweet thing, baby.
The NRA, the National Recovery Act, was ballyhooed with a combination of the 4th of July and a Busby Berkeley musical. Its serious effect was to establish collective bargaining, minimum wages, and huge public works projects.
Roosevelt always said, I will not have a dole in this country. The British had a dole at the time on welfare. And Roosevelt always raised hell on any project. He said, if people are going to get money from the government, they have to work for it.
3.5 million people worked for it in the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The WPA built or improved 1,000 airports, 8,000 schools and hospitals, and hired artists whose work survives.
The New Deal was very sensitive. It's not fashionable now, I know, but the fact is that there was a humanity and there was a decency and there was a sort of creative courage there which was quite extraordinary. There were free concerts in the park, but nobody ever paid more than 50 cents, and most people paid 25 cents or even a dime to see Federal Theater shows. So this brought in an audience.
In addition to the plays, the theater project put on 100 puppet shows a week, and vaudeville shows, and traveling circuses. They went everywhere, in the boondocks and the cities. Many Americans heard an orchestra or saw a play for the first time because the WPA brought it to them. The Federal Theater Project brought together and nurtured talents like producer John Houseman and young actor-director Orson Welles. The WPA gave a start to a number of distinguished American writers, among them Saul Bellow, John Cheever, Richard Wright. The Federal Arts Project brought art directly to the people, in post offices, schools, and public buildings. Hundreds of artists were put to work painting elaborate murals. This one in the Justice Department in Washington by George Biddle glorifies the New Deal. Of the murals, FDR said, "Some of it is good, some of it not so good, but all of it native, human, eager, and alive."
The world importance of the American art movement came right out of the WPA, that artists who would have had to stop being artists because of financial necessities were able to be artists.
Many of them have become America's most important artists. Jackson Pollock, William de Kooning, Stuart Davis, and Shawn, Mark Rothko, Harry Gottlieb, Reginald Marsh.
It left a legacy, of course, a personal legacy and even a spiritual legacy, but it was a relief project, and when the relief need ceased, the project ended.
In 1936, the success of the New Deal won Roosevelt a landslide re-election. Along with success came bitter enemies whose accusations he would never entirely shake. Big spender, opportunist, political chameleon. He was vulnerable to attack for the same reason he was successful. He knew the way the wind blew. He supported collective bargaining, for example, in the National Industrial Recovery Act, and when the Supreme Court struck it down, he tried to pack the court with a Roosevelt majority. But when the Democratic Congress voted no, he stepped aside from labor's continuing battles. The crucial battle was the sit-in strike at General Motors body plant in Flint, Michigan.
I happened to be on the scene, sitting in the sound truck, when the attack came. They began lobbing shells and firing rifles. And the strikers resisting, not only in the picket line, but those inside.
Our existence was on the line because it was our jobs, it was our family. And when we started to go out, they met us with clubs and with guns, shooting tear gas and vomit gas. Everything from that point on becomes kind of wild, because everyone was fighting everybody else. We tipped over cars and tore them apart with our bare hands, and if you ever see men tear something apart with their bare hands, it's one of the most frightening things you ever see in your life. We didn't know what was going to happen next, and the National Guard come in, and they mounted machine guns on both ends of the street. I mean, we were locked right in. We had to remain there. We couldn't get out.
The strikers held out for 44 days, during which General Motors, immobilized, lost $1 million a day. GM surrendered.
Today, we can sit back, we can retire with dignity.
And if the boss is in the way, we're gonna roll right over him, we're gonna roll right over.
Labor's victory was made possible not by Roosevelt, but by a senator from New York, Robert Wagner, whose bill to legalize collective bargaining passed without help from the White House.
It's true that to the very end, Roosevelt was opposed to the Wagner Act. He thought it went too far. And yet, it's also true that he appointed to office the kind of men who drafted the Wagner Act, who made it possible, and he signed the law and he carried it out faithfully thereafter.
Americans who had finished working had no share in labor's new security, and the elderly began organizing politically around pension schemes. Washington heard the message, and Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins began pressing Roosevelt for a Social Security program.
Roosevelt did not run on any program recommending Social Security. He had been talking about Social Security some at the instance of a great agitator whose name was Frances Perkins. She had been talking to him about it over and over and over again.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
Today, the federal government spends more than $100 billion a year on Social Security benefits, far beyond what it started out to be. What Roosevelt described as some protection for the needy has become a life support system. In Roosevelt's first term, the country's midsection suddenly dried up. A 4-year drought turning the Great Plains into a dust bowl, and a disaster for the people whose only living came from the deadened land.
One of my very first assignments in the year 1936 was to photograph the Dust Bowl. Today, it's hard to imagine that this kind of place existed. During the dust storms, when the wind blew hard, people would take their blankets, soak them in water, and hang them on the windows to absorb the dust. We had a real American desert there. It was terrible, really. Look at the height of that sand dune. Just as I was finishing my work, the wind picked up and began to blow the dust and the stinking sand around, and everyone headed for shelter, and I headed for my car, and I turned and saw this scene, which to me summed up the whole relationship of man to his environment. It was a photograph of a farmer, Arthur Coble, and his 2 sons. His sons' names were Milton and Darrell. I went back there a couple of years ago, and I found this little boy, Darrell Coble, now a grown man, with his 2 sons, took them to the same location and made this photograph of Darrell Coble and his 2 sons in a wheat field.
The New Deal programs for soil conservation encouraged contour plowing, soil-saving crops and irrigation, and redeemed the Dust Bowl, which is today a food bank for the world.
I've been having a hard time.
Photographers, who themselves were on work relief from the federal government, documented the life of the Americans who were all but left out of the New Deal's recovery programs, the tenant farmers. Walker Evans' photographs became a famous book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Mary Fields McCrae was in it.
Well, that's all I ever know, was tenant farming. See, my daddy was a tenant farmer, and my daddy was a hard farmer. You bend your back all day and pick the cotton. Oh, it's hard work. Me and my sister and brother-in-law and 2 children lived on $7 a month. We didn't go to doctors then. I don't guess they could pay them. I had the asthma real bad. One day, this man come to me from the rehabilitation, and I don't know how come to come to my house, but he did. And so he sent me to Birmingham to be treated for asthma. And he put clothes on my back. He put glasses on my face. Had my teeth pulled, and he had teeth put in my mouth. I might cry. For they done more for me than anything. And it all come from the rehabilitation. That was Roosevelt doing it.
Congress in 1935 and 1936 set up the Rural Electrification Administration that literally brought the American farm out of darkness. When Roosevelt first takes office, about only 1 out of every 9 farms in the country have electricity. By the time he leaves office, only about 1 out of every 9 do not have electricity.
I think it is the greatest advance of anything that has come to agriculture has been REA, because that furnishes power to do so many things.
Shine, REA, keep on shining, make our living less confining, keep our food all fresh and frozen, cook the dinner while we're dozing, wash our clothes and do the dishes, milk the cows, fulfill the wishes of the husband and the wife, and light us on through life. Pump the water for the chickens, keep them warmer than the dickens, bake the waffles, fry the bacon, help to keep our backs from aching, dry the clothes when it's cold and dreary, light dark corners till they're cheery, bring us news by radio, and glow, glow, glow.
You know, I was in a debate a few months ago with a man who said, yes, this legislation was necessary, but it's all outdated. And I said, well, what about the guarantee of bank deposits? Don't we have that today as we had it under Roosevelt? Yes, we do. Don't we have the Securities and Exchange Commission? As we had it then, we have it now. As we brought the National Labor Relations Act into being, had it then and have it now. The Fair Labor Standards Act passed then, we have it now. The Tennessee Valley Authority, we had it then. Do we have it now? Absolutely. Those are not outdated.
Back again. Back again. We've got Franklin D. Roosevelt back again.
In 1941, Franklin D. Roosevelt would be back again for his 3rd term, which in World War II would greatly enhance his leadership and tarnish it some, too.
Back again, back again. We got Franklin D. Roosevelt back again.
By the end of summer 1941, World War II was already 2 years old. The bombings of London went on every night for 2 months. The United States was still neutral by law, but not entirely in spirit, not in the White House.
I think Roosevelt led us into World War II, and particularly against Germany. And he was a national leader, and I think that's what he should have done.
Franklin Roosevelt had mobilized American industry into his arsenal for democracy, arming England and the Soviet Union by convoy across the Atlantic, running the gauntlet of German submarines. By the time he met Winston Churchill off the coast of Newfoundland in August of 1941, it was clear to both that England could not go it alone much longer. It was an emotional meeting. Churchill pressed Roosevelt toward battle and found a willing listener.
At the Atlantic Conference, there's no question that Churchill tried his very best to get the president to make a commitment. How great a commitment and precisely what kind of a commitment, we don't know. No one sat down and took verbatim minutes. Churchill did go back to his own cabinet and tell his cabinet that the president had told him that they were going to, in essence, create an incident in the Atlantic that would permit the Americans to become more actively involved.
1 month later, an American destroyer gave Roosevelt his incident. The USS Greer had joined a British patrol plane in pursuit of a German submarine and in departure from American neutrality. The ship and the U-boat exchanged depth charges and torpedoes. Later, the logs of the destroyer and the submarine showed the U-boat had fired in self-defense. Roosevelt knew it, but said otherwise.
I tell you the blunt fact that the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer Greer without warning and with deliberate design to sink her.
The kind of lying or deception that Roosevelt practiced was not the kind of deception where conspiracies were set up and broad, bald-faced lies were told. It's just he never really told the American public the full story. He never told the American public how far he expected to have to go.
On December 7th, 1941, it was the Japanese who told the American public how far it would have to go. The attack on Pearl Harbor did overnight what months of Roosevelt's cunning could not do: break the country's neutrality and bring it to war. There is still an argument among academics over just how surprised Roosevelt was. A majority of historians believe the president felt a Japanese attack was probable somewhere in the Pacific, but not at Pearl Harbor. The war effort brought an immediate national unity which the New Deal could not quite attract, and brought social changes the New Deal could not achieve. It brought full employment and ended the Depression. And it opened a revolution for women. The new woman was Rosie the Riveter.
When they gave her a production E, she was as proud as a girl could be. There's something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie the Riveter.
During the war, 6.5 million women left home for the factories, entering the labor force for the first time. They were hustled back home when the war ended, but a mold had been broken.
One historian has said that the experience of women in World War II was the most important single development in the 20th century. The women's liberation experience of the 1960s can trace its roots directly to what happened in World War II. In that situation, with an unprecedented labor shortage, groups that had been excluded before now had an opportunity.
For black Americans, as for women, Roosevelt's legacy was to make the country aware of them, aware of the black underclass, held in place by bigotry. When the great black singer Marian Anderson was forbidden to sing at the Hall of the Daughters of the American Revolution, Eleanor Roosevelt and others provided a stage at the Lincoln Memorial. The New Deal had given blacks the beginnings of hope, but not equality. Not a single civil rights law was passed in the Roosevelt years. In a time when lynching was a common thing, an anti-lynching bill was introduced. Roosevelt made a political decision not to support it.
He explained that he could not make that bill a must because he had to have the Southern votes for what he considered a priority, rearmament, getting ready in case you had to meet a war.
When the war began, the armed forces were segregated. There were 2 black officers in the Army, none in the Navy. The black enlisted men were mostly cooks or laborers, until they were wanted overseas. And there they fought in segregated units. It was Truman who desegregated the military, not Roosevelt.
Roosevelt was cautious on the issue of race. He lacked the courage of his own convictions.
They suffered every kind of indignity. When whites marched up the plank to a troop ship, the band played God Bless America. When blacks marched up, they played the Darktown Strutters Ball. And understandably, there was a deep feeling of indignation on the part of American blacks, and they organized in a way that they had never done before. From 1940 to 1946, the membership of the NAACP increased 9 times.
There was no NAACP for Japanese Americans. There was no defense for them at all. 130,000 were stripped of their rights and all they owned and put in concentration camps for the duration of the war. Roosevelt did not initiate this policy, but he approved it.
There is no question, but his decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans during the war for no reason other than their ancestry was a wretched violation of the tradition of civil liberties he usually honored.
The tradition of America as haven for the oppressed was not honored for Europe's Jews seeking refuge from Hitler's programmed extermination. American Jews were in agony. Hitler's hatred of Jews was known before the war. His destruction of their businesses, theft of their homes, shipments of Jews en masse to concentration camps. That 6 million of Europe's 8 1/3 million Jews were to die in the death camps was not yet known in 1939. But it was known then that there were already 6 major concentration camps, among them Dachau and Buchenwald. And when ships of European Jews sought refuge in America, Roosevelt would not intervene to override the immigration quotas and let them in.
The question of admitting refugees to the United States during a depression, especially Jewish refugees, people who were not winning medals of popularity in the United States, required an enormous political courage. The SS St. Louis was a boat from the Hamburg American line that had about 983 mostly Jewish refugees. Some of them had been through terrible torture. It came to Havana Harbor in mid-1939, then made its way to Miami, and the passengers aboard actually saw the lights of the harbor and were not allowed to land. We estimate that perhaps a little less than a third of the passengers who were already in sight of the lights of freedom were consumed by the flames of the Holocaust. We couldn't break through, couldn't get the story believed, and without getting it believed, we couldn't get public opinion. And without public opinion, we couldn't get Roosevelt, who was a political animal and who might have responded had there been pressure. Remember, the rescue of the Jews was a very minor peripheral problem in the heads of decision makers. Their problem was first to survive, to endure, and then to whip the Nazi war machine.
And when the whipping was almost done, the problem was to negotiate the division of world power among the victors. A problem in that one of the victors would be the Soviet Union. At a cost of 20 million lives, Russia had beaten back the Germans from Eastern Europe, and Stalin was determined to hold the countries now occupied by the Red Army as a permanent buffer against any future attack. At a meeting at Yalta, Stalin made the empty promise of free elections in Eastern Europe and went away with the sphere of influence that exists today.
I think that Churchill and Roosevelt, by the time they had gotten into the Yalta Conference, were perfectly willing to relegate Eastern Europe, including Poland, to Soviet political and military domination. I do not think that Roosevelt grasped just how authoritarian or totalitarian the Soviets would be.
After Yalta and the resulting actions taken by the Soviet government, I think that Father began to realize that maybe Mr. Stalin was not as trustworthy as Father had thought in the beginning of their relationship. And the tone of his communication with Stalin in the last few weeks of his life were much harsher and much more direct and disapproving than it had been in the earlier days.
The Soviet sphere of influence, confirmed at Yalta, is what the American government faced in 1982, trying to figure out what, if anything, could be done about repression in Poland. The Roosevelt years left us a great power and frustrating limits to that power.
He failed to prevent what we have come to call the Cold War.
I come from the Crimea Conference with a firm belief that we have made a good start on the road to a world of peace.
6 weeks later, he was dead of cerebral hemorrhage while sitting for a portrait in Warm Springs, Georgia. When Roosevelt's body rode the train to Hyde Park, he was seen by his mourners as the man who was elected 4 times to preserve capitalism in the Great Depression and freedom in a great war. After his death, his critics supported the amendment to limit the presidency to 2 terms, ironically fixing Roosevelt in history as the only 4-term president.
I think he was a politician. I think he was devious. I think he was wrong when he said he was going to balance the budget. I think he was wrong when he said he was going to keep us out of war. And I remember the comment of Oliver Wendell Holmes about him, that he had a second-rate mentality but a first-rate personality. But having said that, and having put that all aside, he was our greatest president in my lifetime.
Well, of course you can talk about Roosevelt's mistakes or the errors that he committed, but that don't give you the story of this man, the inspiration that he had, and could translate that inspiration to the country. He was a people's president. We've never had one just like him. I remember him. I revere him.
The theme of this broadcast has been who we were before the Roosevelt years and who we became as a result of them. We are the people who 50 years ago saw responsibility for the poor and the old and the unemployed as a local option. Today, the national values insist on a national safety net, insist that certain New Deal institutions survive: Social Security, collective bargaining, financial regulation, care for the land. Franklin Roosevelt is a symbol of the time when lost hopes were found, when a failed system was revived and revised, and when Americans who seemed to have lost any idea of who they were anymore found in the adversities of a Great Depression and a war against evil a more humane identity.
Roosevelt saved the day. He was the greatest president in our time. He liked the people. Was it Lincoln that said, of the people, by the people, and for the people? I think FDR exemplified that, if anybody did. Yeah. Yes.